Well, thank you for joining us for our next lecture on not more I'm sorry, a lecture on Mesilat Yesharim. And we are in the middle of chapter 11, and we are in the middle of studying the Amida of the trait of Nekiyut, which we translate as, how did we blamelessness, but I didn't really like that. I think of it as like perfection or doing things right, not just doing them, but doing them right. And he mentioned that there are certain sins that are so common, but we don't think they're common because and his first example is gezel, is stealing. And he says, although the vast majority of us don't have a problem with none of us really go into somebody else's house and grab things and run, right? That kind of stealing we generally don't do. Most of us aren't computer hackers, taking money away from other people's bank accounts. But nonetheless, we still are guilty of stealing in ways that are more subtle, and it's very important for us to watch out for them. So one of the things he emphasized before were things like stealing time. Like if you're hired for a certain amount of time and you're being paid by the hour, and sitting around, wasting time when you're being paid for it. And he emphasized over and over again how important it is to be honest, and to not take advantage of other people, and to be cognizant when you're taking things away from people in more indirect ways. So he's about to say, the Hebrew reads, V'af Eov Hayed al Atzmo v'Amar. Job also testified regarding himself when he talked. Remember, in Eov we read of the terrible suffering that Job had went through, despite him being introduced as having been a very honest, upstanding, God-fearing person. And Eov, during his suffering, complained to God, turned to God, and testified to his own innocence. His friends that visited him were telling Eov, you must have done something wrong to deserve these punishments. And Eov insisted that he didn't, that he was good. And one of the main things he said was as follows: Im tite ashuri mini haderach. If my steps have even strayed slightly from the proper path, v'achar einai holach libi, and if my heart followed my eyes, in other words, I desired something and chased after it, even though it wasn't necessarily appropriate, uvichapai dovak ma'um, and have my hands even grasped or as things that have stuck to my hands, even the slightest thing that I didn't deserve or shouldn't have had. So, in other words, he was swearing that he didn't even the slightest bit stray from the proper path in terms of his honesty and his dealings with others and other people's property. And think how beautiful this mashal, this parable, this idea is. Because Kidima Hagezel Habilti Nigleh, he was comparing things that are stolen but not revealed, right? In other words, things that people wouldn't necessarily know that they're stolen. They're not obviously stolen. He compared that to Kidavar HaMizdabek Bi'adam, like something that just sticks to your hand, like dirt that sticks to your hand. A person doesn't go with the intention of taking whatever it is that sticks to his hand. But in the end, it gets stuck to your hands on its own because of the things that you're doing. Things get stuck to you, and you end up dragging them along, and they should never have been stuck to you in the first place. So biyado, even though you didn't intend on taking them. In the end of the story, they are yours, and you should be careful. They're not yours. They are in your possession, and they shouldn't be. Kain hadover hazeh. This is what this type of stealing is like. Sha'af shelo yeh ha'adam holech v'gozel mamash. Even though a person is not going and actually physically stealing things openly from someone else, kashehu, it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult to live a life in which our hands are completely clean and completely empty from things that we shouldn't have, that we came across in questionable ways. Amnam be'emes, in truth, right? This all comes out of the fact because our hearts, meaning in this context, the things that we want, right? We all want money, right? We all want nice things. We all want certain pleasures, right? So, and our heart, Moshel Ba'inayim, rules our eyes. So that's where we end up looking and gazing and saying, oh, I want that. I want that, that thing. So, this little bit of cheating here and there, a little bit of lying here and there, all of a sudden becomes something that we want to do. Right? This is because, um, if we didn't allow our hearts to rule our eyes, then but what happens is our heart doesn't allow us to just let things be the way they are by the people who have them. Like, let our friends, if someone else has something, we shouldn't look at it as if we desire it. We should be fine and happy with them having it, right? And levakesh, and then the eyes draw the heart levakesh heterim, to seek all kinds of justifications, Na'im al mashinir lem yafa v'nachba, to things which appear to the eyes as if they are good and desirable. Al kain amar Eov, which is why Eov said shehu lo chein asa, he never did anything like that. V'lo holach libo achar einav, he never allowed his heart to follow his eyes. His eyes, see something that he wants, and then allowing his heart to devise ways of getting them that aren't necessarily appropriate. Al kain lo davak b'chapav mo'om, which is why not even a tiny bit of anything stuck to his hands. Let's think a little bit. He's going to give more examples. He gave the example of misusing time that you're being paid for. He's going to give a lot more examples, many of which are extremely relevant. They have always been relevant and are very relevant today. Kama nokel hula adam. When it comes to hona'ah means, it could be translated as fraud, but it specifically means to overcharging. Selling something for more than it's really worth. Trying to get more out of a business deal than you really should, and if you were being fair. Kama nokel hula adam, how easy it is for a person patos to be seduced, v'li kashel, and to stumble. It seems to him that it's appropriate to try liapos, to make his merchandise look really nice, right? I made a beautiful table. I want to make it look really pretty and nice, right? And you know what? If this leg is a little shaky, I'll kind of, stick it in with a little bit of glue, so in the store it looks good, even though you and I both know that the glue is going to hold up for 2 weeks. He's going to put it in his house and the leg's going to fall off, right? But it looks nice, right? And everything looks great. So I'm going to sell it, right? I want to make my merchandise. And you justify it to yourself. I worked really hard on this table, and it is nice. Look, it's a beautiful table, right? But then you and you all can think of examples like this, whether they're physical items, which some of us might make a living selling physical items. Most of us probably don't. But whatever it is that we're selling, whether it's a product or a service, making it sound better than it really is, right? And making it look better than it actually is. You're trying to sell an investment, and you fudge the numbers a little, make it look, or you convince him to, something about the market which isn't really true, right? The daber alif hakona, I should speak to the person who wants to buy, to the potential buyer, leman yisratzlo, to speak to him in order to convince him why he needs this table. What do you imagine? And it's a bunch of baloney. He can do just fine without your table, but you make a whole story. It's the famous used car sale. Oh, this special, it has this special feature that you won't find in the other cars. How convenient it is. Well, you and I both know the chances of the guy ever needing that feature are very, very slim, and certainly not worth paying the extra money for it. The Yomer al Kol Zeh, and what Chazal, the rabbis, taught us about such things, Yesh Zariz v'Niskar, there are those who are careful, or are Zarizim, that they're industrious, they work hard, and they are rewarded for that. V'yad Charutzim Tashir, right? And it's true, right, that the one who is, and you're telling yourself this, you even bring verses to support yourself. See, the Torah says one who works hard is going to get rich, right? The one who is careful is going to get wealthy from his things if you're diligent. So you justify it. It's so easy to justify it, But if you're not really careful and watch what you're doing, instead of selling someone wheat, you're going to be selling him thorns, right? And it's obviously it's a mushal, it's a parable, but we can understand. You're selling but nowadays, the used car salesman who sells you a lemon would be the equivalent mushal today, the equivalent saying. In the end, he is transgressing, and he is committing the sin of hona'ah, the sin of fraudulently overcharging. This we were commanded in the Torah. It says, "Lo tonu ish es am Yisrael," one should not defraud his friend. And they said, and he's fending off those who will justify to themselves. And there's plenty of people who try to do this. That it's okay if they're not Jewish. I can, make it a little shady here. So I feel the Ramot etagoy also, right? Even if he's anyone, you're not allowed to trick anyone into, spending some more, whether they're Jewish or not. Ukrok siv she'eret Yisrael, and he brings the Talmudic reference for that. Ukroksiv, and it says in the verse, she'eres Yisrael lo yasu avla, the remnant of Israel, those people, lo yasu avla, should not do anything that is wrong, that is inappropriate. They shouldn't speak falsely. V'lo yimatze b'fiyem l'shon tarmes, and in their mouths there shouldn't be found any even remnant of deceit. And so what we say, especially in business dealings, especially when we're selling somebody something, not to lie and not to even fudge the truth a little bit to make it sound better. You can, if you're trying to sell and you have an old table and you polish it up and make it look new, and then you say, oh, it's a new table, right? You want to make it look new. You can't do that, right? You have to be honest. Ein ma'arvin peros beperos. It also says you're not allowed to mix fruits. Afilu chadashim b'chadashim. Even if you have two sets of new fruits, you have two batches of apples. One is a certain type of apple, the other certain type of apple, and they're all new, but they're still of different quality. Not to mix them together in order to sell them all at a higher price, right? Afilu saw b'dinar. Even if you have and it's a problem almost counterintuitively. Even if you have apples which sell a saw, which is a measurement, that on the proper market rate at the time, a saw of this particular fruit sells for a dinar, right? And then you have another bucket of fruit that sells a saw of a dinar of tarsis, which is worth a dinar plus a tarsit, which is like a few pennies more, right? And mixing them, lo ya'are v'imkrem saw b'dinar. You shouldn't even mix them together and sell them as a saw dinar for a dinar, which is the lower price. Now, immediately you're going to think to yourself, well, why should that be a problem? I'm mixing better fruit with worse fruit and selling it at the worst fruit price. But what happens when you do that, right? When you do that, the person thinks he's getting better fruit at a good deal. That's also stealing, right? Because this guy goes home thinking, oh, I got the fancy fruit for a good deal. And that's a lie. It's not true. You gave him half of the stuff you gave him was not the good fruit. So even if you think you're doing a good deal by giving him a better price, you're still stealing, because he gets to go home. He goes home to his family, and his guests saying he got the good stuff and he didn't, right? And that itself is stealing as well. So honesty is the bottom line. Anyone who does anything like this, right, who commits any type of avel fraud, kari chamisha shemos, is called by 5 names. Avol, he's unjust. Sanoi, he's a hated person. Meshukatz, a disgusting person. Mitoav, an abominable person. Cherem, a person who we shouldn't have anything to do with. And Toeva, again, is he's abhorrent and disgusting. It's going to be interesting how we're going to learn this language of Toeva, right? Which very often nowadays is the similar language that's used to describe a homosexuality in the Torah, right? We'll find it here used over and over and over again, repeatedly in Chazal, as a reference to someone who lies and cheats and is dishonest, even in such a in a plain way. Another example that I came across, I'm going to read to you, which he doesn't bring over here, but it's a good example of this. And it's in Mishle, in Proverbs, chapter 6, verse 16. Sheish heinos onei Hashem. There are 6 things that God hates. V'sheva to'avas nafsho. And there are 7 things that are disgusting and that are an abomination to God. And those 7 things are einayim ramot, a person who is haughty; l'shon shakar, a person who lies; v'yadayim shofchos tamnaki, and a person who takes advantage of others; lev choresh, Machshavos Oven, a person who's constantly devising evil plans. Oven, I mean, Raglayim and Maharos Lorotz Lora, a person who's constantly running to do bad things. Yofiach Kizovim Mechaker, a person who says false things about others. Umeshaleach Medana Beinachim, a person who incites hatred among others. And that's what a real Toeva is. That's an abomination in Mishle, and that's the similar abomination to what he's discussing here. I wish everyone thought about this, and we'd be in a much better world. But Od Amru Zichron, and furthermore, the rabbi said as follows: Kalagozel es chavero, anyone who steals from his friend, afilu ashava pruta, even just the amount of a pruta, which is a tiny sum, a few pennies, right? Ki'ilu noto nafshe mimeno, it's like taking his soul away. You're taking away something that belongs to someone else. You see how severe this sin is, even if it's just a small amount of money. So don't justify yourself and think, oh, it's just a little bit, it won't matter. I'm only taking a few pennies. It's bad no matter how you twist it. God holds back the rain only over the sin of gazel, of stealing. V'od amru kupa malea avonos, right? If you have a box full of sins, right? Let's say the people are all sinful. There's all kinds of things people are doing wrong. Mi mekatreg barosh kulam, but who's the one that really comes before God and says, out of the whole box, the one that gets up and says, listen, God, these people are no good. They deserve to be punished. Gezel, stealing. V'dor hamabul, we know from the Torah itself that the generation of the flood, lo nechtam gzardinam el ala gezel, the reason why they were destroyed ultimately was not because of all the other sins they committed, but because of stealing. Vim tomar bilavavcha. So if you're going to think to yourself, and I'm sure if there's anyone here that works on Wall Street, they might be thinking to themselves, how are we supposed to do business if we're not going to try to convince our customers that we have a good product to sell? Are you telling me I'm not supposed to talk up my product, right? How am I supposed to do business? I'm supposed to go in there and say, here, buy this investment. It's miserable, right? This company is going to probably go broke in 5 years, but I think you should invest. How are you supposed to do business that way, right? I can't sell used cars if I tell them, yeah, this car was in 4 different accidents, repaired 6 times, it needed engine repairs 12 times. But right now it runs if you turn the key. So how can I do business like this? He says, Chiluk gadol yesh badavar. There's a tremendous difference. It's very easy to know the difference and what you can and can't say. And it's very simple, and all of us could think of it, really, if you really think about it. And when you hear complaints like that, it's really, those complaints are total nonsense. Because anytime you're trying to show a buyer the truth about whether or not something is a good product, then that's appropriate, right? If it actually is a good investment, then sell it and go ahead and talk about how good it is. If it actually is a good car, then go ahead, talk it up as much as you want. You can have the most you can tell them all kinds of things. If it has some fancy features that you think are useful, go ahead, talk them up. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're talking in such a way that you're trying to cover up for a flaw, and just think about it. Am I saying what I'm saying because I'm trying to cover something up? Then Eino Ela Hona Asr, then that is fraud and it is prohibited. Vizek Klal Gadol Be'amunas Hamasamat. And that is the big rule when it comes to trustworthiness in business. So that is the bottom line. And it's really a simple thing. Just think to yourself before you talk. Am I saying the truth or not? And that's easy after that, right? And if you're not sure if it's the truth, then say that. Tell them, I heard this company, people say it's good, and some people say it's bad, and that's the truth, right? Lo omer me'inyan hamidos. I don't need to discuss the issue of measurements. Remember, in those days, it was simple, right? If you have a weight that was a pound, let's say, and you sell somebody a pound of of wheat. So, and then you make your measurement, a pound minus a little shaves off, and then you're giving him less wheat. So you make a little more money and you're cheating. I don't need to tell. So now there's equivalents nowadays of that, using measurements that are designed to show that something is more valuable than it really is. Then that would be a modern equivalent of doing something like that. Although nowadays too, I'm sure a gas station, if they wanted to jiggle around with the computers in the tank, in the thing, they could do it so that you're not really getting a gallon, you're really getting 9/10 of a gallon. But I'm sure the places do that kind of stuff today too. But regardless, I don't need to talk about that because, sorry, when the Torah talks about it this explicitly. Toavat Hashem alecha kol osei. This is disgusting. It's an abomination to God. Anyone who does this, kol osei avel, and it's referring. If you look in the context in Devarim and Deuteronomy, it's referring to using false measures. V'yamru zichronim levracha, and the rabbi said, "Kasha ansham shel midos me anshan shel arayos." Much more severe is the punishment for false measures than the punishment for sexual sins. The Amru Hasiton Mekaneach Midosav, and it says, it gives advice that a person who is a siton is it's used in modern Hebrew to refer to a wholesaler, a middleman, a person that sells in bulk, right? He has to make sure to clean his measurements, to make sure that his measurements are appropriate every 30 days. He has to make sure that, because they deteriorate over time, and he has to make sure every 30 days to keep them accurate. Why so much? It's a lot of work. If a guy's selling huge amounts of merchandise, he has to do it so that he shouldn't inadvertently make a mistake. We're not talking about a guy who started off with bad measurements. We're talking about a guy who started off with honest measurements. He still has to make sure he's staying honest. And then he talks about something which is really important. And it is something worth thinking about. The Torah prohibits ribis. Torah prohibits ribit, lending at interest, right? And when the Torah discusses the importance of lending money, the Torah is referring to lending with the intent to help people, right? You lend somebody money with the expectation of being paid back in a certain amount of time in order to help them through a tough time. Now, the Torah never discusses lending as something appropriate when the purpose of the lending is in order to make money, right? And this is something that in our economy, it's hard for us to imagine lending money without interest. I mean, we still find, in some communities, you'll have like a loan, interest-free loans, which is a tremendously wonderful thing. But if we think from the Torah's perspective, when you help someone out, it's not supposed to be in order to make money. Jeffrey, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I thought the rule is only a Jew to Jew, but it was okay for Jews to lend to non-Jews.
Well, there is such a thing in halacha, but the overall thrust of the Torah is certainly highly discouraging of that type of lending because you're taking advantage of other people, right? I'm not going to go into the halachic details right now, but there's no question in the Torah that it certainly looks down at ribis, at lending with interest, and it's certainly not an honorable thing for anyone to do. Whether historically, this money lending is a big issue, which is not really the place for today. But it is important to remember that by its very nature, ribis, or interest, is something anyone, and most of us probably have been and probably are to some degree beholden to people that have lent us money, whether it's to get a mortgage on our house or a loan for our car or a personal loan for this or a loan for education. And these things, they tie us down for the rest of our lives, and they become a burden after a long time. They start to become more and more difficult, especially when you're lending at interest rates that are higher than they should be. So the point of lending in the Torah's scheme is not in order to make money. The point of lending in the Torah scheme is in order to help somebody who needs help, right? That's the point of lending. And it's a bigger tzedakah on a certain level than giving someone money, because when you lend them money, you give them the opportunity to pay you back, so they're not beholden to you, and they don't feel like they took a favor for nothing, right? They feel like, okay, I'm borrowing it now. And, a lot of people say, I would rather borrow money if they can than receive money, because it makes you feel more independent. It makes you feel, now the sin, and one of the reasons why I stopped and talked a little bit about this more than the other topics was because, unfortunately, in our day today, there's a lot of people who push themselves off as religious people and are involved in usurious lending, are involved in lending money at predatory rates. And I'm not going to point fingers at anyone specific, but some of us may know such people, and I think it's probably the worst sin you could possibly imagine. And the statement he's about to make, avon haribis, the sin of lending at interest, is gadolhu kikofer belohei Yisrael, is nothing less than denying the existence of the God of Israel. So in other words, it's literally an absolute contradiction for a person to pass themselves off as a religious person who makes his or her living by lending at especially lending at rates that are predatory.
But if there is no rate and it's just like a loan that you can pay back, it's fine.
If it's interest free, then it's a mitzvah, then it's special, right? Then it's a good deed, right? But if it then you're doing it to help someone, and nowadays I think I'm not going into the specifics of the halacha because there's a lot of law halacha written about this, which is way too detailed. But for now, the general idea nowadays, there's no question that predatory lending to people that at incredibly high interest rates, that's way over market, is totally against everything the Torah stands for. And chas v'shalom, God forbid, it's as bad as completely being a kofar, as completely denying religion, denying God completely. And I can't possibly say how much damage has been done to the Jewish people. Literally, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Jews have died because of accusations against moneylenders. Now, most of it was just anti-Semitic nonsense. But to the extent that there was ever even a smidgen of truth to it, Jews lending money and taking advantage of the people that owed them, it's awful. It's worse than awful. And to the extent that there are people today that are involved in this kind of what they call a business, it's terrible. It's really terrible. And they might as well not be religious at all. And that's what Chazal say, not what Saul Weinreb says. So if you see a guy with a long beard, right, that's what they say in Bava Metzia, and that's what the Ramchal said. It's as bad as being kofer belokei Yisrael, right? Denying the God of Israel. So if you see a guy with a long beard who is a loan shark, then that's what the actual Torah says about him, regardless of how much he thinks he deserves to stand in front of shul and pretend that he's a tzaddik. Okay. So I'm saying this because I have unfortunate personal knowledge of some of this stuff.
Well,
but go ahead.
I think it is. I just think it's actually a very fascinating topic because there are so many Jews in the financial world, right? It's like it's a stereotype, but it's also true, right? There's a lot of Jews who either have a lot of money and wealth for various reasons, and it's not all bad reasons. But I think a lot of it is that they have been involved in the financial sector where they've loaned to people at a large scale. They've been involved in businesses, owned them, merged them, acquired them, whatever, like the whole 9 yards of this corporate America stuff. And that's the whole basis of the business, is to take advantage of people, all people, but especially disadvantaged people like minorities and stuff that can't afford a house or whatever anyway. So then they lend them at ridiculous rates and
they're gonna foreclose because they can't afford
they're not gonna be able to afford
and then it just causes terrible suffering. And you're right, and it's awful. It's worse than awful. I mean, think about the damage that guys like Bernie Madoff did to the Jewish people. And a lot of these guys that make money this way turn around and give big donations to the big Jewish institutions, and they have wings named after them.
Right.
And then and meanwhile, they're loan sharks, and that. It's like we learned before, a person who shakes a lulav on Sukkot and he stole the lulav, it's useless. God looks at that lulav and at best he laughs, but worse, he realizes it's a terrible sin. Don't shake that lulav before me. And if you support your family or your religious institutions because of money lending, and I'm not going to say any of this online because it's recorded and it goes on YouTube, So you'll have to talk to me offline when we're not being recorded if you want more specific examples. But there's a lot of institutions that get supported by people that make their living this way, and it's awful. It's worse than awful. It's terrible, absolutely terrible, and it's literally the absolute opposite of our religion. It's kofer b'elokei Yisrael. Those words are, again, the words of the Gemara and Bava Metzia. Kofer b'elokei Yisrael. You're denying the God of Israel. There's simply nothing worse. That's as bad as it gets. V'yomu zichronim levracha al pasuk, and the Chazal say, the rabbis teach us, and they said in reference to the following verse, the neshech nosan v'tarbis lokach b'choy lo yichya, right? He has loaned money with interest, right? And he has taken it. Shall he then live? No. Lo yichya, he shall not live. This is a verse in Yecheskel and Ezekiel. She'eno chai l'tchias hamesim. Such a person has no life in the future world to come after the resuscitation of the dead. Tchias hamesim, he's gone. That person is out. Kihu v'avak shelo, he and his dirt, right? Whatever dirt he rotted into, mishukatz umitoav be'eni Hashem, is disgusting and is an abomination in the eyes of God. Ve'eni roet tzorach la'arach bozeh, I see no need to continue a lengthy discussion of this topic. Shekvar emaso mutelas al kol ish Yisrael, because the fear of this sin is cast its dread on all people of Israel. If only this was true. Unfortunately, it's not true, but I guess maybe in Ramchal's time it was, or maybe he was, but such is the way it is. Omnam, however, klolo shel davar, the general rule is, and he's about to wrap up the issue of financial crime and Nekiyut, the idea of not stealing doesn't just mean running over to a lady in the mall and grabbing her purse and running, right? Stealing is a lot more deep than that, and it's something that we all have to watch out for. Just like the desire for money is large, the people desire money. In the same way, the ways that we can fall and be trapped and stumble are many. And if a person truly wants to be clean of stealing, he has to be very careful, and he has to think, and it requires thought. This is one of the main themes of Mesilat Yesharim. We've emphasized this several times, and it's the idea: thinking, learning, studying is important, right? So thinking about what you're doing, studying the details of what you're doing, studying it and comparing it, and studying the Torah so that you're guided by the right morals and ethics. I mean, that's really the foundation of Musar in general. That foundation of Musar is that sitting here and studying these things and talking about things will ultimately translate into us acting and living better, right? And if a person is truly clean of this and clear of this sin, yeda, he will know such a person has reached a really high level. There's lots and lots of people out there who are very pious and all sorts of pious things. You know, they have the best sukkah, they have the biggest lulav, they have the tallest mezuzah, whatever it is, right? They keep everything exact. They only eat a certain hachsher. They don't well make sure that not just kosher but super kosher, whatever. They're very, very pious in all kinds of things. But when it comes to staying away from and hating profits that are not appropriate, they have not even come close to the circle, right? To even close to being complete. And this is what Sophar the Na'amati said to Eov, to Job. Now, Sophar, by the way, was one of the friends of Eov who was trying to tell him, well, maybe you're not so great. Maybe you did a sin. Maybe there was something wrong with you. Maybe that's why you're suffering. Okay, that was what Sophar and the other two friends were constantly telling him. So in that context, think about the next verse. He says to Eov, to Job, if there may have been some sort of sin in your hand, something, distance it from yourself. Don't allow to reside within your tent any kind of wrongdoing, which is basically a reference to there might be something that you own that's not 100% yours. Something that you you fooled somebody, you talked up a little, something's not right, right? That's how you can clear yourself from any flaws, and you'll be pure and you have nothing to be afraid of. He was suggesting that Eov, of course, as we saw a few paragraphs ago, told him back, no, that's not true. There's nothing that I did wrong. And we know what's interesting about the story of Eov is that we listen to all these friends telling Eov, maybe you did this wrong, maybe you did that wrong. But they don't know what we know as the readers of the book of Job, and that is that God himself testified in the beginning of Eov that Eov was perfect, right? Right. So we watch the process of these people trying to find a sin that Eov committed, when you and I, the reader, know that they're not going to find one because there wasn't any. And that when Eov is constantly saying, I don't have any of these things, he was really telling the truth. He wasn't just bragging. But the idea of so far, the idea that even great people like Job, like Eov, probably there's something wrong. Nobody's perfect. Everybody does something. Everybody cheats on their taxes a little bit, right? Everybody lies a little bit. Everybody cheats. It's that attitude, of course, that just starts the ball rolling down the hill, and then God only knows where it ends up rolling. So, until this point, I've been speaking mitzvah. I've only been talking about the details of one specific commandment, gezel, theft. Everything I've said until now, and remember, so what he's telling us is the idea of ribis, of interest, of overcharging, of talking up the value of my product inappropriately, and all these things are all considered part of theft. And every one of the commandments, we can sit and talk for hours on end about the details. The point being that just saying that I don't steal, or just saying that I don't XYZ, whatever sin it is, that's not enough, right? You have to really, are you really doing the point, right? Are you really a person that cares about not taking advantage of others and not taking away from other people that which is due them and that which they should have? But I'm talking about some of the most common ones that so many people stumble in, and so many people are unfortunately guilty of violating. So the next one he's going to talk about is going to be the subject of sexual sins. When I first started reading this, I started thinking, that nowadays we obviously have different ethics, different morals. We have different ways of thinking about these things. But then when I was reading it again today to prepare for tonight, and I realized it's really not that much different, and we'll see what we do when we go through this. And I'll give you some examples to illustrate what I mean and as we go through it. But now let's discuss forbidden relations. Because this is also something that people desire, people want, and people often stumble in. This is the next level after monetary theft. It's another thing that people desire and want. And after theft being much more prevalent, more common, but this one's also pretty common. This is number 2. Similar to like the statement which I quoted already before, Rubam begezel, most people stumble in the sin of stealing miyutam, but then there's a significant minority who stumble in the sins of arayot, sexual immorality. A person who wants to be completely clean of this sin. This also requires a significant amount of work. Now, I want you to think when we think about a sexual sin, right? We may have different images that come up in our mind, but just the image that I think that should come up in your mind is try to think what's an appropriate way. And one of the things that come up to mind today is issues which are very common and very relevant, issues of sexual harassment and taking advantage of people because of a position that you're in, or usually it's a man taking advantage of a woman. Think about those kinds of sins, and of course, other sins like immorality with someone else's spouse, which is doing something bad to the person that you're committed to. The kinds of sexual sins that are timeless and that people are constantly falling into. And think about these things, and we're going to go through this, and I think you're going to find that a lot of this is very relevant to us today. It's not just about having sex with a person that you're not supposed to have sex with, right? It's all the things that are close to it, that surround it, right? So just because I didn't have sex with so-and-so doesn't necessarily mean that what you did was okay, right? The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is Bill Clinton's famous words, "I never had sex with that woman," right? So, I mean, depending on how you define sex, you can argue that maybe he's right, but the bottom line is that what he did was wrong. Why was it wrong? Well, I'm not here to explain, but it's obvious that what he did was wrong, taking advantage of a young woman and in the position of power that he was in, etc. It was wrong. It was just wrong. So he didn't have sex with that woman. I guess if you're going to define sex only as sexual intercourse, then I guess he's right. Right. But so think about that in almost all of these kinds of things. And Mikra Malihu, this is a verse, Lo tikrevu legalot erva. Do not come close to galot, literally means to reveal someone's nakedness, right? So what this means is legalot erva, the erva is to making someone so vulnerable, right? Revealing their vulnerabilities, right? Don't even come close to it. Don't start skirting around the edges. Like Chazal said, God said, I'm not allowed to have sex with this woman, right? Don't say the following. And this is a justification that we hear all the time, right? I'm not supposed to have sex with her. So Rainy Tovsa, I'll just grab her. I'll slap her behind. I'll I won't have a sin because I'll rub up against her. I'll walk past her in the cooler and I'll just rub and say, "What did I do? I just bumped into you." Right? Oh, Sha'ani Noshka, I'll give her a kiss. And I won't have any sin. Right? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God says, just like if a person, a Nazir, would makes a shvuah, swears that he won't drink wine, so he's also lechol anavim lachem. He's not allowed to eat, moistened grapes, vivashim, and dried grapes, and mishras anavim, or even water that's soaked in grapes, v'chol hayotzim migefen yain, or anything that's made out of wine, right? So af isha she'ena shalcha, a woman who is not yours, she's not your wife, she's not someone that you have an appropriate relationship with. So also liga b'choleker, don't touch her at all, leave her alone. A person that touches a woman who is not his brings death to himself, and so on. And it's a quote from Shmuel Rabbah. So the idea of staying away from anything that surrounds these kinds of sins is very important. Lo tikrevu, don't even come close. Don't justify it by saying, well, I didn't sleep with her, so it's okay, right? And think about how incredible, how wonderful this statement is about the Nazirite. It compared this prohibition to the prohibition against the Nazir. The actual sin in the Torah is specifically drinking wine. That's it, right? And the Torah, though, prohibits, despite the fact that the real problem is drinking wine, the Torah says not to do anything that is even similar to drinking wine or has anything to do with drinking wine. The Torah is trying to teach us, by telling us this, is teaching us a lesson for all of the Torah. We have the rule, whenever the Torah says something in one place, it's teaching us a lesson. Unless we have a reason that it only applies here, it applies everywhere. Right? The Torah is teaching the wise men how should they make fences around the Torah, b'mishmeres, right? In order to guard, they were given the task of putting guardrails around the Torah, making sure we stay away from these sins. The Torah was instructing our sages to learn from the idea of the Nazir, because of the primary prohibition. They were charged with prohibiting things that are even similar. Right? It turns out that the Torah is teaching and commanding. When it tells us this about a Nazir, it's telling the Chachamim, the sages, what they should do about all the mitzvos in the Torah. Leman das, in order that they should know, this is what God wants. When it tells us you're not allowed to do one of these things that are prohibited, you should learn that which isn't written from that which is written. Use your head. Think about why it says what it says, and then think about what kinds of things you should also not do, even if they're not explicitly written. So just because it explicitly says not to have sex with her, think twice and realize that it means a lot more than that. Right? This is why, and it was in this path, and this according to this idea, that the Chachamim prohibited regarding this topic, anything that's similar or related to forbidden sexual relations, things that are like it, whether it is in action, like the examples he gave before, kissing, rubbing, bumping, all kinds of things, whether it's looking, and think, staring, looking inappropriately, whether it's speech. So don't get up and say, oh, that's just locker room talk. I'm allowed to say that. I think most people would know what I'm referring to. That's not a justification. It's not okay. It's not okay to speak just because, oh, I didn't do anything. I just said something abusive or something wrong. It's disgusting. Whether you're hearing and not protesting when you hear something and you accept it. But even thinking about doing such things are things that you should watch for. There's more, of course, but I think this is a good stopping point. Because he's going to bring proofs for all of these types of categories of things, doing, seeing, speaking, and he's going to give categories and examples and proofs to those points in this subject. So I think it's a good stopping point. And I see that, Jeff, you have your hand up, and so you go ahead, you can ask. Fire away.
This last thing, I'm reading the quote from the version I have, and they say exactly whether it prohibited all forms of unchastity, and whether it is gazing. Okay, I can understand that, gazing, gaze away. Okay,
right.
Okay, so you just don't get speaking. That's a little okay. Listening.
Well, that's why I gave the example, which is obvious.
Yeah.
The
thinking is the one I wanted to focus on, because I always thought, and certainly the legal system, I'm a lawyer, we make an important distinction between action and non-action. Right. And indeed, if you really, I guess I'll speak for my own self, if you talk about thinking, and I'm thinking of average watching television at night.
Right.
I mean, how can you avoid thinking, if you will? There's a beautiful girl on
right.
there, and you say, oh, whatever you think about it, dreaming, whatever. It seems to me it undermines the very purpose of this entire system, which is to allow people to avoid sin. And this is such a broad net that it necessarily say to yourself, well, if thinking about sex is the same thing as touching or grabbing, then the whole system seems to me to fall apart.
Yes. So we're going to talk about each one of these 5 in slightly more detail next time. Okay. So we'll discuss this more thing, and B, I kind of discussed examples of abusive types of treating another person, a woman specifically, partly because I was preempting what your question. Okay. In other words, if you think that what he's telling you is you're not allowed to think about sex, right? Okay. Then I don't know that that's necessarily I think what he's talking about is thinking about inappropriate things, right? So thinking about and imagining and planning, eventually the kind of thinking that might lead you to actually do something that's wrong is inappropriate. And we should control. If a thought were to go into your mind, that somebody came over to me, right? And this isn't a non-sexual issue, but I think it's relevant. Somebody asked me, and I'm not going to say too much of what the context is how would you like to make some real money? Okay, this happened to me about 2 months ago,
Okay.
and I'm not going to tell you who it was. Doesn't matter. And I said, would you be interested in making real money? I said, yeah, I guess I'm interested. What do you? But then he started, no, I mean like real money. So then I realized right away, So I was a little curious. So I started asking what he means. But then after about one sentence, I said, no, thank you, whatever. And so that kind of thinking, right? Thinking about doing something that is wrong, in some cases just blatantly wrong, or maybe the kind of skirting the edges of wrong, and think about it that way. It's the same thing when it comes to thinking about sex, right? Just thinking about sex in general, that's not the sin. The sin is thinking about things that you shouldn't be thinking about, and planning and thinking about things that are going to lead you to behaviors that are inappropriate. When such thoughts come to your mind, you should tell yourself, I understand, we all desire stuff. We desire money, we desire sex, but this is not the kind of thing I should be thinking about. It doesn't mean you can't think about sex. It just means you can't think about wrong things, And if you remember it that way, I think it's a pretty good guidance. Similar to his guidance before. How do you know the difference between a used car salesman? When is it okay for him to talk up the car and when it's not okay? Well, is it true or not true? The same thing here. Is this thing that you're thinking about, is it okay? Is it appropriate, or is it wrong? Well, if it's wrong, then maybe you should think about something else, you know? And I think that's the guidance that we need to keep in mind. And we will have a chance to talk about this in more detail when he specifically discusses thinking. The way I learn this and understand this now is different than it was when I was in yeshiva many years ago. But this is the way I really understand it today. So that's why I'm teaching it now like this.
Well, on that one, I just want to add something, which I have a cousin who was very religious, a young man. So I had lunch with him in the cafeteria, secular context, but he's very religious.
Mhm.
And when I said that I don't say occasionally, prayers before eating or
Right.
prayers after, he said that's stealing from God. And he really can't be yeshiva educated. That's what he learned. You're stealing from God. And I said to myself, if that kind of a way of terrorizing young people into
Well, that he is saying that it is based on Chazal. I forget the exact language, but
Okay,
it's
well,
not baseless.
okay.
The rabbis do say that, but how you say it and what exactly you mean is a different story.
Okay.
But
I think
yeah, you should say the blessings.
Well, you should, but the
But,
idea of magnifying it that you're.
I'm not going to yell at you, or I'm not going to call you a thief, but you should.
I understand. That's why I've always wondered. Okay.
Yeah, I don't believe in scare tactics either under most circumstances, under 99.9% of circumstances, mostly because they just don't work. So I look at that and I say, I don't think about the threat of being a thief and being scared. I look at it as the idea of saying, remember, we should remember that whatever we enjoy in this world, it's at God's behest, and that's a nice thought. It's not a scary thought. That's a wonderful thought. Okay,
I feel
go
like,
ahead.
well, just kind of going off of what he was saying, I think that it is, if we take it very literally, that that God prohibits this thought, I think that that's impossible to prohibit it because it's a natural human inclination. We're going to have these kinds of thoughts, particularly in this world, in the non-Muslim, I don't know, whatever, like, I guess where I'm going with this is like Muslim women, right? The ones that cover their entire bodies. There's a lot of justification and understanding of that cultural and that belief and stuff, because that does prevent this whole thought process. So like in theory, a man that sees a woman who's just completely in this black robe and all you can see are her two eyes out of a slit, that's supposed to prevent him from having sexual thoughts about her. And whether or not that works, I don't know, because I'm not a man, but it sounds like it kind of does. So it's just kind of interesting.
Well, let me
it's
tell
like,
you
how far
First
do you
of all,
go?
I'm not sure that it works.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
I'll give you a personal example, and this is on YouTube.
Oh no.
But
She showed her ankle.
the first time in my life I was ever had any like sexual thoughts about a beautiful woman, and I swear I'm not making this up. My grandmother, who grew up in British Mandate Palestine, had pictures all over her house from British Mandate Palestine. It's, so she had pictures of an Arab goat herder in the desert, and these are all photos that she had. I don't even know where she got them from. One of my cousins probably has them. And she had one picture in her dining room. It was a really beautiful picture, and it was a Bedouin woman who was wearing the whole garb, and all you were able to see were her eyes, and she was tending her sheep, and she had the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen. And I must have been like 12 years old, and I just could not stop looking at her eyes. I just thought, like, that is just beautiful,
It's the mystery.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure that it works. But okay, let's say
I don't know. Like there is something. I mean, I've heard there's
but-
something about women's hair that really is like a sexual.
A lot of it is culturally I'm not an expert in these things, but we respond to the kinds of things that our minds, a lot of them is cultural things. A lot of it is, because different times people perceive different things as beautiful depending on different times in history. I mean, there's all kinds of research you can read about this stuff. But the bottom line is that I don't think he's telling you that, when Saul Weiner was 12 years old and he saw this woman's eyes, that I was doing anything wrong. I think that it depends on where my mind was to go after that. To think somebody's beautiful and be, turned on, whether sexually or just to think she's beautiful, that's not the issue. That's normal, right? The issue is where you go with that,
But if you act on it.
Yeah. Especially if you act in an inappropriate way. You say, okay, I'm gonna, take advantage of somebody, do something wrong, do something inappropriate, or if she's someone else's wife, cheat on my spouse, or do something wrong. That's where the thoughts lead you in the wrong direction.
So anywhere in the book, and when it comes to this, is there anywhere addressing women, or is it only addressing men, just based on the time it was written?
Most of it is male, from the male perspective. There's no question of that. Every once in a while, you might find little things coming out there from the female perspective. I try, but it's hard for me just because of the way I grew up. It's hard for me to keep saying he or she, but I try. I hope you notice that I try. But there's no 99% of these lessons are relevant. Some more relevant for men than women. Like this particular issue, probably more relevant, but it's not irrelevant to women.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So it's certainly relevant, and it's usually men that are taking advantage of women, but
not always.
Not always.
Yeah.
So it's relevant to all of us. But most of the Torah and most of the rabbinic literature is written from a male perspective. And it's just the way it is, and the same way as most of all literature was, but in those days. So I just try my best to equalize it, but it's but nowadays we all try to learn from the same wisdom because it matters to humans, regardless of gender.
Amen.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions, ideas, objections? If not, we'll 2 weeks, which is, let's see, November the 18th, we will meet again and continue this long chapter, which will probably take us at least 2, probably 3, maybe even 4 more weeks. But it's a long one, but it's a really important one. So enjoy. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Saul.
You're welcome.